What if the future King of England were to reveal that he could never forgive his own brother? Picture it for a moment. A monarch in waiting a man, moulded from childhood under the strictest codes of duty, of honour and of silence, suddenly turning away from the only person who once carried the same burden of grief. That is the story we are about to explore in depth. And let me be clear, this is not some romantic tale of reconciliation. It is a slow and painful tragedy, one that began in the heavy shadows of a funeral and over time erupted across the front pages of newspapers around the globe. Before we go further, take a moment to press the like button, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Prince William, Prince Harry. Two brothers who once walked side by side, bound together by the heartbreaking loss of their mother, Princess Diana. For many years, they were more than siblings. They were each other's strongest ally, the only people who truly understood what it meant to live beneath the suffocating glare of the royal spotlight. Together, they laughed. They shared secret jokes. They rebelled quietly, and they dreamed of carving out a life that might feel just a little more ordinary than the one demanded by the crown. But that shared dream has long since soured. Today, one brother stands firmly at the very centre of the monarchy's destiny, carrying the weight of an entire institution. The other lives thousands of miles away, separated by oceans and continents, hurling accusations through interviews across television screens and into the heart of public opinion. And what lies between them is not merely distance. It is something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous than geography. It is betrayal. Why betrayal? That single word carries enormous weight. Betrayal is never just about wounded pride, hurt feelings, or an ordinary family quarrel. In the world of Prince William, betrayal means something far deeper. It is the breaking of an unspoken vow, a silent promise that has allowed the British monarchy to endure and to protect itself for hundreds of years. In William's eyes, his brother Harry committed the unforgivable. He broke open the carefully constructed walls of secrecy. He invited the outside world to peer into the fortress of the crown, and when he did, he painted that ancient institution in the darkest possible colours: dysfunction, prejudice, cruelty and neglect. For William, this was not simply an act of disloyalty. To him, it was nothing short of war. But before we move too quickly, pause for a moment and consider this. How could two brothers who carried the same grief, who faced the same relentless cameras, who were bound by the same destiny, reach the point where they now despise one another? Could it really be explained by Meghan Markle as so many? Headlines insist, or is the truth far older, buried in the roles assigned to them from the moment they drew their first breaths? One, the heir; the other, the spare. Because this saga does not truly begin with Meghan. Its roots are found in the story of Diana's sons, two boys who never had the privilege of a normal childhood, forced instead to grow up inside the most scrutinised family on the face of the earth. And it all traces back to one grey morning in September of 1997, the day when their childhood was shattered forever. Let us return to that moment in time. London. The streets overflowing with flowers, drenched in tears and wrapped in a heavy silence. William was just 15 years old. Harry was only 12. Side by side, they walked behind the coffin of their mother. Countless millions of eyes fixed upon them. Countless millions of hearts broke for them. Yet no one could hear the storm of thoughts inside their minds. No one could feel the ice running through their veins or the tremor in their young hands. And still, the world watched every step. That single harrowing walk was etched permanently into history, the image of two boys standing together against the weight of the world. From that day forward, the brothers were mythologized as inseparable. The elder portrayed as solemn, protective, a reflection of the future that awaited his father. The younger, cast as mischievous, charming, eager to slip away from grief that felt suffocating. They became known simply as the boys who lost Diana. And for a while, that bond was not just a story told to the public, it was real. Harry leaned upon William for strength. William stood as a shield for Harry. Together, they navigated the demanding years of Eton. The discipline of the army, the whirlwind of girlfriends, the sting of press scandals, the responsibilities of charity work. No matter what challenge appeared, the message from the palace was always the same. The brothers are strong, the brothers are united. But was that bond ever truly what the world believed? Or was it only the illusion of unity, a polished surface carefully hiding decades of quiet tension? Think about it carefully. Could anyone honestly grow up at peace, under labels as unforgiving as heir and spare? Imagine being told from the very moment of your birth that your worth, your very purpose, was measured by the order in which you arrived. William was born to inherit the crown, raised with the knowledge that one day he would be king. Harry was born not to rule, but to serve the one who would rule a permanent second place in a game he never chose to play. No matter how hard Harry worked, no matter how much charm or warmth he displayed to the world, his role was always conditional. If William were to have children, Harry's importance would shrink further, his place in the line of succession pushed down step by step. And that is exactly what happened. This unshakable dynamic, the heavy weight of destiny pressing onto William's shoulders, and the constant sting of irrelevance shadowing Harry's every step, was the seed from which everything that followed would grow. Resentment rarely erupts in a single moment. It does not explode overnight. Instead, it smoulders, it simmers, it lingers quietly for years, until the smallest spark can set it ablaze. And when Meghan entered Harry's life, she became that perfect spark. But wait, we are not at that part of the story yet. Before rushing forward, we must pause to understand why this history matters so urgently today. The monarchy itself now stands at a crossroads. Queen Elizabeth is gone. King Charles sits on the throne, but everyone recognises that the true future rests in the hands of William. Every decision he makes, every judgment he forms, every word he chooses carries consequences that ripple far beyond the family. They shape the very survival of the monarchy in the 21st century. So if William despises Harry, if forgiveness is impossible and reconciliation forever off the table, that choice is not only about two estranged brothers. It is about whether the monarchy projects an image of stability or of collapse. It is about whether this ancient institution can survive the fierce winds of modern scrutiny, or whether it will finally fracture and fall apart from within. And make no mistake about it, the world is watching every move. Public trust in the monarchy has grown fragile, its foundation less certain than ever before. In the United Kingdom, support is slipping away, especially among the younger generations who question whether the crown still has a place in their lives. Across the vast Commonwealth, the voices calling for independence, for breaking ties with the monarchy, grow louder and more insistent with each passing year. In that climate, the image of William and Harry standing side by side could have been a symbol of unity, of resilience, of modernisation, of hope for a new era. Instead, what the world now sees is division, bitterness, and silence. The one thing the monarchy cannot afford has become the very thing it is defined by. So let us be absolutely clear. This is not a petty tabloid quarrel. It is a constitutional drama, a global spectacle, and at its core, a profoundly human tragedy. A man who is preparing himself to be king refuses to forgive his own brother. And that brother, rather than keeping silent in loyalty, has chosen to speak out, to broadcast his pain openly to the world. Which one of them is right? Which one of them is doomed? That is the haunting question that hovers over this story. Now, consider this possibility. What if Harry had never spoken out at all? What if he had chosen to swallow his grief and his anger, to remain inside the palace walls, to play forever the role of the loyal spare? Would William still look at him with resentment? Or would, William have leaned on him, trusted him, and relied on him as the only soul alive who truly understood the crushing burden of royalty. These are questions we can never answer because Harry made his decision. He chose love. He chose freedom. And in the eyes of William, he chose the unforgivable. He chose betrayal. In the chapters that follow, we will go deeper, far beyond the surface. We will trace the hairline fractures that began in childhood and slowly widened into unbridgeable chasms. We will examine the explosive arguments that erupted behind palace doors, the public words that tore through the carefully maintained image of unity, and the decisions that left scars impossible to heal. We will walk through the wedding that split the family in two, the interviews that shocked the entire world, and the book that William is said to view as utterly unforgivable. We will see how Meghan became both the convenient scapegoat and the powerful symbol of change. And we will confront the most unsettling question of all. Is this rift between brothers a wound that can never heal, or has it already calcified into permanence? But for now, hold on tightly to a single image. Two boys walking behind the coffin of their mother, silent, bound together in grief so overwhelming that it silenced even the crowds around them. That image is forever frozen in time, etched into memory and history. Yet the truth, however painful, is that even then their futures were already being pulled in opposite directions. One destined to be the heir, the embodiment of duty and restraint. The other branded as the spare, restless, rebellious longing for freedom. One cast as protector, the other yearning to escape. What followed would force those labels into stark reality. Harry would come to embody the spare in the most dramatic and public way imaginable. William, in turn, would grip duty ever more tightly, his jaw clenched with anger, his path unbending. And then came the change that would alter everything. The arrival of Meghan Markle was not merely the unfolding of a love story. It was the spark that ignited a war. And no one, not even the sons of Diana herself, could have foreseen the storm that was about to break. What if the greatest royal feud of this century did not truly begin in adulthood at all, but instead took root quietly in the shadows of childhood? What if the unshakable bond between William and Harry, so often portrayed as a chain of steel, it was never as indestructible as the cameras and headlines led the world to believe? We have long liked to imagine them as simply Diana's boys, inseparable, untouchable, walking behind their mother's coffin as symbols of unity and resilience. But here is the harder truth. Even in those years of mourning, small cracks were already forming. Cracks invisible to the public eye. Cracks that, given time, would stretch and widen until they opened into a chasm of resentment and betrayal. So let us return to the very beginning. Picture Kensington Palace in the late 1980s. William already serious even as a child. His uniforms neat, his blonde hair carefully combed, his appearance as polished as tradition required. Teachers described him as focused, disciplined, and mature at times, so much so that he seemed older than his years. Harry, by contrast, burned with a different energy. Mischievous, fiery, a flash of red hair that matched his spark of rebellion. He was the boy pulling pranks, darting away when no one was looking, always testing the limits. The palace told the public this was charming, even adorable. The heir was dutiful, the spare was cheeky. But pause for a moment and think about what that message truly meant. From the very beginning, William was shaped and cast as the responsible one, the child being carefully trained to be king. Harry, meanwhile, was labelled as the comic relief, the extra, the one who could afford to make mistakes. At least, that was the story everyone repeated to him. Now, here is the contradiction laid bare. Harry's position as the spare seemed to offer him a kind of freedom, yet that very freedom became its own prison. On the surface, he could laugh, play the joker, push boundaries, rebel openly, and shrug it all off as harmless antics. But deep inside, he understood why such indulgence was possible. It was because no one truly expected him to shoulder the crushing responsibility of the crown. Imagine growing up hearing that your brother's single misstep could destabilise an empire, while your mistakes were brushed aside as nothing more than family embarrassments that lasted a week or two before being forgotten. How could that relentless comparison not erode your sense of worth? How would it shape the way you saw yourself in a family where importance was ranked at birth? This painful imbalance did not escape Diana. She loved both of her sons with a fierce devotion, determined to give them as normal and balanced a childhood as she possibly could under the glare of the world's cameras. She tried to shield them to ensure they knew they were equals in her heart, even if the monarchy insisted otherwise. And what happened when another strong, independent woman later entered their world? That is the moment the story bends sharply. A twist no one inside the palace walls could have predicted. Because Meghan Markle was never simply a bride added to the royal family, she represented change, disruption, even rebellion. She was a revolution in human form, and that revolution would not just rattle tradition, it would drive a permanent wedge between the brothers who once clung to each other for survival. But let us step back and face a more haunting question. What if your fate was sealed before you could even speak your very first word? What if the measure of your identity, your value, and your entire purpose in life was dictated the instant you were born? That is the merciless truth of is monarchy. One child is declared the heir destined to inherit the crown. The other is branded the spare existing in perpetual second place. And in the House of Windsor, those roles were never light-hearted labels. They were invisible chains. They were cages that trapped both William and Harry, shaping their lives in ways that neither could fully escape. Let us be completely honest. The monarchy survives and flourishes because of its strict devotion to hierarchy. It cannot function without one figure raised high above all others, a single unbroken line of succession that defines the very stability of the crown. William was that line, the anchor of continuity. From the instant of his birth, he was handled like the most precious cargo in the kingdom. Every step of his childhood was calculated, every lesson carefully engineered, every public appearance rehearsed until perfect, and every possible misstep guarded against with fierce vigilance. Harry, on the other hand, held value only so long as William's destiny remained uncertain. His position was never central, but conditional, serving as a backup plan, a living form of insurance, the safety net the monarchy relied on in case the heir faltered. And once William became a husband and later a father with each royal child that arrived, Harry slipped further and further down the ladder of importance, his official purpose shrinking quietly but steadily until it seemed almost irrelevant. Now, pause for a moment and try to imagine the weight of that reality. What must it feel like to be both indispensable and disposable at the very same time? To be cherished publicly, yet sidelined privately, to be visible in the world's gaze, but invisible within your own family's hierarchy. That paradox is not just a detail of Harry's upbringing, it is the very essence of his life story, and the monarchy never sought to disguise this cruel imbalance. In fact, it leaned into it. William was presented as the diligent, responsible student groomed tirelessly for his throne-bound future. He was photographed in moments of discipline and duty, studying intently, rehearsing diplomacy, shaking hands with statesmen and dignitaries even before he reached adulthood. Every image of him reinforced the narrative: here is the future king, polished, prepared, and irreplaceable. Harry, by contrast, was given a very different role to play. He was permitted, even encouraged, to be cheeky, the mischievous one, the joker who could lighten the mood. The press loved it, feeding off every prank, every rebellious smile, every headline that painted him as the naughty prince. And the palace, far from silencing this portrayal, allowed it to thrive. Why? Because it perfectly reinforced the story they wanted the world to see. William was the serious one, the embodiment of a future monarch. Harry was the colourful background character, entertaining but ultimately secondary. Yet pause for a moment and consider this haunting question. What truly happens to a child who grows up being told again and again that he is the spare? Does he lean into the freedom that comes with lower expectations, relishing the chance to live without the same suffocating chains? Or does he carry a quiet, unspoken yearning for recognition, for validation that will never be given? Harry's own truth is layered, messy, and deeply conflicted. At certain times, he enjoyed his position on the margins. Being the spare meant he could pursue paths William never could. He could serve boldly in the army, fight on the front lines, and place himself in danger in ways the heir was forbidden. He could embrace nights out, indulge in the thrill of living with fewer rules, fewer chains, fewer eyes, watching his every step. Yet, beneath that surface of freedom, there was always a deeper wound, a constant whisper in his heart that said, "You are second best. You are the backup plan. You exist because the system requires you, not because it needs you." And here is where the story takes on its darker truth. William did not design this system. He never asked to be born the heir, yet knowingly or not, he gained from it at every turn. Teachers instinctively looked to William as the leader. Staff deferred to his opinions. Even members of their own family treated him as the priority, the one whose future carried weight, while Harry's carried little consequence. William was the chosen path forward. Harry was the shadow cast behind him. Years later, Harry himself would admit that this dynamic left him feeling like an outsider in his own family. A supporting figure pushed aside by the destiny his older brother inherited the moment he entered the world. This imbalance was never confined to the privacy of palace walls. The press magnified it again and again, shaping public perception with headlines that could not have been more different. One day, the papers would celebrate Prince William, future king, impresses at Eton. Right alongside it, another headline sneered, "Prince Harry parties hard with friends." The same family, sometimes even the same event, yet the portrayals stood in sharp contrast. And here is the painful truth. The palace communications team itself often tilted the scales deliberately, protecting and polishing William's image, while leaving Harry exposed. Why? Because William's reputation was tied directly to the survival of the monarchy. His dignity and credibility were assets of the crown. Harry's, by comparison, was considered expendable, a casualty the institution was willing to accept. Now let us turn the lens and play devil's advocate. There are those who argue that Harry had opportunities William could never touch. He trained as a helicopter pilot, fought openly in Afghanistan, and enjoyed periods of anonymity William could only imagine. William's every move was mapped in suffocating detail. His entire life dissected from friendships to romances, from his studies to his public image. By contrast, Harry's leash appeared longer. He had the space to make mistakes, to experiment, to rebel openly without the same catastrophic consequences. Was that not, in its own way, a gift? Perhaps, yet here lies the heart of the contradiction. Freedom without identity, freedom without purpose is hollow. Harry was not truly free to shape himself into anything he desired. He was free only within the small confining box of the spare. He could misbehave, but only as the naughty prince. He could serve honourably in the military, but his service would always be overshadowed by his brother's destiny. He could fall in love, but the woman he chose would forever be judged against his secondary status. Yes, the monarchy gave him space to act, space to breathe, but it never gave him meaning. It never gave him the dignity of purpose. And in the end, that void would prove heavier than any crown he would never wear. William, by contrast, carried a burden that was just as heavy, though in an entirely different form. From childhood, he bore the crushing weight of responsibility. Every tiny misstep had the potential to destabilise the crown. Every rumour or whisper had the power to cast doubt on his destiny. He did not have the luxury of rebellion. He could not cut loose, could not vanish into anonymity, could not live beyond the suffocating walls of the institution that constantly monitored him. If Harry's curse was a kind of invisibility, being seen as unnecessary, William's curse was relentless visibility, being scrutinised without pause. Both brothers endured pain, but they endured it in opposite ways. And those differences shaped not only their characters, but the course of their fractured relationship. Think about this with care. William grew up with the unshakable knowledge that one day he would inherit far more than a crown. He would inherit the trust, the faith, and the expectations of an entire nation. Every aspect of his upbringing was meticulously structured as preparation for that future role. Meanwhile, Harry grew up with a very different understanding. He knew that one day William would inherit everything, while he himself would inherit nothing. That imbalance does not dissolve with time. It grows, it festers, it becomes a wound that never heals. It is no wonder that Harry has often spoken of feeling as if he lived forever in his brother's shadow, because he truly did. And not merely in a poetic sense, but in the most literal ways possible. Family photographs placed William squarely at the centre, while Harry stood slightly off to the side. At public events, William was spotlighted, while Harry lingered on the margins. Even official royal portraits reinforced the hierarchy, positioning William as the focal point and Harry as a secondary figure. That arrangement was not coincidence. It was deliberate, it was symbolic, and symbolism repeated over and over again ceases to be mere imagery. It becomes lived reality. Now, let us pause and examine a critical turning point in this story. When William married Kate, the dynamic between the brothers shifted in a way that could never be reversed. Overnight, Harry was no longer simply the spare to the heir. He became the awkward third wheel, the unmarried bachelor, trailing behind what the press hailed as the golden couple. The media wasted no time in seizing on this image. Headlines branded him the lonely prince, highlighting his solitude at every opportunity. Public appearances reinforced the picture relentlessly. William, Kate and Harry, a triangle in which Harry inevitably appeared as the outsider. Was this the precise moment when the rift between the brothers began to grow wider? Quite possibly, because for Harry, William's marriage altered more than just his brother's future, it altered his own. Suddenly, William's role as heir was solidified not only by the institution, but also by the presence of a flawless partner and soon after a growing family. Harry, by contrast, drifted further into uncertainty, mocked more than ever as the spare without a true sense of purpose. And it was during this new chapter that the seeds of betrayal began to take root and grow. William moved steadily into his destiny, with Kate by his side, a picture of royal stability. But then came the moment that would haunt the family narrative for years, the infamous bridesmaid dress dispute. The story goes that Meghan and Kate clashed over little Princess Charlotte's dress before Harry and Meghan's wedding. One account claimed Meghan reduced Kate to tears. Meghan later gave her own version, insisting the opposite was true, that it was Kate who made her cry. Years later, the details remain unresolved, hanging like a ghostly presence over the public's imagination. And why did it matter so deeply? Because it was never just about a dress. It was about the press, building a narrative, saintly gracious Kate set against difficult, demanding Meghan. The palace, instead of stepping in to clarify, chose silence. To Harry, that silence felt like the deepest betrayal proof that his wife's dignity was expendable. To William, however, shielding Kate's reputation above all else seemed entirely justified. And in that choice, another wedge was driven firmly between the brothers, pushing them even further apart. But here is a surprising and often overlooked twist. Even on the wedding day itself, beneath the grand spectacle and dazzling smiles, tension quietly simmered. Reports later suggested that William and Harry barely exchanged words, their once unbreakable bond reduced to a thin layer of polite formality played out under the unblinking eyes of the cameras. The question lingers. Had William already begun to believe that Harry was steering the monarchy into dangerous waters, risking the stability of the very institution they were both born to serve? And, at the same time, had Harry already concluded that William was dismissive, condescending, and unwilling to defend Meghan in the same fierce way he had always defended Kate? And then there was the sermon. Who could forget Bishop Michael Curry's electrifying words, his fiery sermon about the power of love that resonated across the globe? It captivated millions watching on television, a moment celebrated as bold, inclusive, and refreshingly too modern. Yet, behind the closed expressions of the royal family, insiders whispered that many found it excessive, too long, too emotional, too American, too untraditional. Imagine that contrast. While the world celebrated, the very family hosting the wedding shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Two parallel realities played out at the same time, colliding in front of the world. So, ask yourself, this was that wedding? Is truly the joyful celebration of love it appeared to be? Or was it, in truth, the opening salvo in a much larger war of values and cultures? On one side stood the monarchy anchored in tradition, silence and control. On the other stood Harry and Meghan, symbols of modernity, diversity, and unapologetic outspokenness. As the newlyweds left the chapel to the cheers of the crowds, they believed wholeheartedly that they had captured the love of the people, and indeed for a moment they had. But within the palace walls, a different story was taking shape. The whispers grew sharper, more insistent. Meghan was too much. Harry was reckless. And the monarchy, wary of the storm it sensed brewing, began to close ranks around itself, preparing for a conflict that had only just begun. And this is where William's perspective becomes essential to understand. Above all else, he believed in duty and appearances, and in the absolute necessity of control. To him, Meghan's complicated family background, her fierce independence, and her refusal to quietly accept the silent, obedient role expected of a royal wife were not just personal quirks, they were risks. Risks that threatened not only Harry's stability, but the image and survival of the monarchy itself. William viewed the crown as something fragile, constantly under attack its strength, dependent on unity and silence. In his eyes, every scandal, every break from tradition, every moment of unpredictability weakened the foundation of an institution already under relentless scrutiny. So when Harry declared with certainty that Meghan was the woman he would marry, William could not see love, he saw looming disaster. Yet Harry did not care. For once, he was not following William's path, not living in William's shadow. For him, the wedding was more than a union. It was a declaration of independence, not from the monarchy in full, not yet, but from the dominance his brother's role had always cast over his life. And here lies the cruelest irony. That day was meant to be the happiest of Harry's life, a moment of triumph and joy. Instead, it became the very event that deepened his estrangement from the family he had hoped Meghan might help him reconnect with. Pull back for a moment and ask yourself, was the wedding truly the fairy tale dream it seemed to be? Or was the glaring warning sign ignored by everyone who wanted to believe in the story of love? The celebration was fragile, a surface-level spectacle. The cheers of the crowds outside masked the tension and silence within the palace walls. The photographs immortalised smiles, but they could not capture the cold glances and clenched jaws. The love story enchanted the world, but it unsettled the crown, leaving fault lines that only widened with time. And what followed confirmed that this day was not the conclusion of their story, but the beginning of its unravelling. Because Once the vows were spoken, once the kiss was sealed, once the carriage ride was complete, the fairy tale faded. The harsh, unrelenting reality of royal life came crashing in. And that reality would not just test their marriage, it would threaten to break it apart entirely. What came after the honeymoon was darker, lonelier, and far more explosive than anyone could have imagined. And it was in that crucible of pressure and pain that Harry and Meghan were pushed closer to a decision no one inside the palace could have foreseen. What if the fairy tale castle, admired by millions around the world, was never truly a dream at all, but instead a gilded cage? What if those palace halls, gleaming with centuries of history and tradition, echoed not with warmth or love, but with isolation, coldness, and suspicion? For Harry and Meghan, entering married life within the monarchy did not feel like a continuation of their romantic story. It felt like the beginning of a relentless trial by fire, a test that would challenge every part of who they were. Picture this. You have just experienced the wedding of the century. Billions across the globe watched, millions cheered, and the world celebrated as if a modern fairy tale had come to life. And then within mere days, you find yourself locked behind ancient walls, where every word you speak, every gesture you make, even the thoughts you dare to express, are dissected, criticised, leaked, and twisted into headlines. Welcome to life inside the palace. And here is the sharp truth. Meghan thought she was marrying the man she loved, a prince who had chosen her for herself. What she did not realise, not fully, was that she was also marrying an institution, one that operates with its own rules, its own power, and its own merciless demands. Let us set the scene. Harry and Meghan moved into Nottingham Cottage, a modest residence on the grounds of Kensington Palace. On the surface, it was quaint and cosy, a charming little home tucked away in a corner of royal history. But very quickly, that cottage became something more than a residence. It became a symbol. Because inside those small, seemingly idyllic walls, the couple began to experience what Diana had once warned her sons about, that the royal family, despite appearances, is not truly a family at all. It is an institution, often referred to as the firm, a machine built to protect the crown above everything else. And in that business-like world, Meghan was not welcomed as a daughter-in-law or embraced as an equal. She was treated as if she were an employee, a figure to be managed, controlled, and moulded into the expectations of the monarchy. Here lies the contradiction that defined the early months of their marriage. Meghan was adored by the public in the aftermath of the wedding. Crowds filled the streets, chanting her name. Newspapers celebrated her style, her elegance, her charisma, her ability to connect with people during speeches and appearances. For a brief moment, she seemed to embody the hope of a modern monarchy. Yet inside the palace walls, a very different narrative was already being crafted. She was branded as difficult, as too outspoken, too opinionated, too unwilling to bow her head and accept the silent role expected of her. Harry saw it immediately, almost instinctively. After all, he had grown up in that environment. He knew the courtiers, the so-called men in grey suits, whom Diana herself had despised. These shadowy figures controlled schedules, shaped public statements, and managed which stories appeared in the press. And as time went on, Harry noticed something disturbing. Positive stories about Meghan, stories that highlighted her success and her impact, seemed to vanish without explanation. Meanwhile, negative stories, rumours and criticisms spread like wildfire across the front pages. This left him asking a chilling question. Was this incompetence a failure of palace management, or was it something darker? Was it sabotage from within? And this is where William's side of the story enters. Reports suggested that his household, his personal staff, often clashed bitterly with Harry's team. What began as petty rivalries between offices soon escalated into serious battles for influence and control. Press briefings, which were supposed to present unity, increasingly appeared to favour William and Kate, sometimes at the direct expense of Harry and Meghan. Imagine the situation: two brothers already at odds in private now, surrounded by rival teams leaking and spinning stories, each side fighting to protect its own narrative. What the public saw as tabloid drama was in fact a family feud carefully disguised as palace media management. Now, let us step deeper into Meghan's personal experience inside the palace. She had lived her entire life as an independent woman, a successful actress with an established career, a humanitarian with her own causes, a woman who had built and owned her voice. Suddenly, within the confines of royal life, that voice was stripped away. She was told to keep quiet, to smile politely, to wave gracefully, but never to speak too much, never to shine too brightly, never to risk overshadowing the senior royals whose status demanded priority. For Meghan, this was not simply frustrating, it was suffocating. The independence that had defined her identity was replaced by silence and invisibility. She would later reveal that the isolation grew so intense she felt desperately lonely, cut off from the world, and at times even suicidal. And here is the most shocking revelation: when she reached out for help, asking the palace for support, she was denied. She was told that seeking help would reflect poorly on the institution. Consider the cruelty of that reality. A family that presents itself as devoted to service, to caring for the people, could not even bring itself to care for one of its own. Meanwhile, Harry watched all of this unfold with growing fury. To him, it was history repeating itself in the most painful way. The cold indifference Meghan faced reminded him of Diana, his mother, who had also been left vulnerable to the hostility of the press and the silence of the palace. Once again, there was no protection, no defence, only whispers and inaction. That silence enraged him, and as his anger burned hotter, so too did the distance between him and William. William, in Harry's eyes, was no longer simply his brother. He had become the embodiment of the very institution that was destroying the woman Harry loved. Yet here lies the piercing irony. To the outside world, Harry and Meghan seemed to be thriving. They were not merely royals, they were global stars. Their tours drew enormous crowds. Meghan's charity cookbook for the survivors of Grenfell Tower soared to bestseller lists. They were young, radiant, and glamorous. To millions of people, they looked like the bright, hopeful future of the monarchy itself. But behind the palace walls, behind the carefully staged photographs and polished appearances, the truth was far darker. They were not flourishing, they were breaking peace by painful peace. And here comes a twist filled with bitter irony. While Meghan was publicly criticised for being too much, she was simultaneously expected to do more appearances, more flawless smiles, more charity projects to uphold the family's image. She was caught in a double bind where no answer was ever right, too visible yet somehow not visible enough, too outspoken yet expected to be endlessly inspirational without ever crossing invisible lines. How does anyone win in such a game? The truth is simple: you don't. William, observing all of this from his position as heir, reportedly grew increasingly frustrated. In his view, Meghan was failing to adapt, failing to grasp the weight and gravity of royal life. He believed Harry was enabling her independence, encouraging her defiance, rather than guiding her toward the strict discipline of duty. But what was this stance from William? Was it the protective instincts of an older brother trying to preserve stability? Or was it arrogance, the heir looking down with quiet disdain at the spare and the partner he had chosen? So let me turn the question to you directly. Do you believe Meghan ever truly had a chance? Could anyone carrying her background, a divorced American biracial woman who was outspoken, passionate and independent, have survived unscathed under the crushing weight of centuries-old expectations? Or was she doomed from the very instant she said yes to Harry? Because here lies the cruelest irony of all. The very qualities that drew Harry to her, The independence that inspired him, the confidence that lifted him, the passion that made her magnetic were the same traits that within the palace walls became twisted into accusations and weapons, used to diminish her. And Harry, he soon found himself cornered by a devastating choice. He could remain silent, as William always had, swallowing the pain and preserving the institution. Or he could take a stand and defend Meghan, even if doing so meant clashing directly with his brother, with his father, and with the very monarchy itself. In the end, Harry chose Meghan, but that choice came at a cost. The cracks that had once quietly fractured the bond between the brothers widened into gaping canyons. Staff loyalty splintered as households turned against one another. Headlines grew sharper, nastier, more merciless, and the suffocating atmosphere inside the palace became unbearable. Within those walls, Harry and Meghan were not truly building a future together. They were struggling simply to survive. Each day brought another negative story, another smear splashed across the papers. Each night ended in another argument over how to respond, how to endure, how to protect themselves from forces that felt impossible to fight. And yet, the deepest question of all still lingers. Was this storm really about Meghan? Or was she merely the scapegoat, the convenient flashpoint for a rivalry that had been simmering between two brothers since childhood? The heir against the heir spare, the leader against the rebel. Meghan may have been the spark that lit the blaze, but was the fire not already burning long before she entered their world? By the time their son Archie was born in May of 2019, the transformation was undeniable. The brothers were no longer brothers in arms. They had become rivals in every sense. Harry had chosen to step onto his own path, no matter the risks. William, meanwhile, had doubled down on his destiny, embracing duty more fiercely than ever. The cracks that once seemed manageable were no longer cracks at all. They were fault lines, threatening to shatter the entire foundation. And the next step was not to retreat quietly into distance. It was to defy openly. That defiance would come in the form of a decision so radical, so explosive, that it would send shockwaves through the monarchy, the media, and the watching world. What Harry and Meghan announced next was something no one, not even William, could have been prepared to face. What if a prince, born into centuries of tradition, chose to turn his back on the crown? What if the very system that moulded him from birth became the prison he longed to escape? For Harry and Meghan, the decision to step back from royal duties was not a casual choice. It was an earthquake, a rupture that sent shockwaves through the monarchy, the media, and the world. And even now, years later, the aftershocks are still being felt. Here is the hook. No one truly saw it coming. No one, except perhaps the Harry himself. Let us rewind to the beginning of the year 2020. By that time, the cracks in their lives were no longer cracks at all. They had widened into chasms. Harry and Meghan had endured 2 relentless years of tabloid attacks, of cold and calculated palace politics, of a growing and bitter estrangement from William. Behind the polished public smiles, they were not thriving. They were exhausted. They were broken. They were trapped. And then, quietly came the tipping point. At the end of the year 2019, the Sussexes chose to spend their holiday in Canada. For most royals, Christmas at Sandringham is a non-negotiable tradition, a ritual steeped in duty and appearances. But Harry and Meghan did not go. Instead of walking with the Queen to church, they retreated to near seclusion on Vancouver Island. And, in that quiet sanctuary, for the first time in years, they tasted freedom. The air was different. Away from the cameras, away from the courtiers, away from the suffocating machinery of monarchy, they could finally breathe. And it was in that fragile stillness that the whispers between them grew, louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. What if we never went back? What if we built a life outside the crown, a life on our own terms? Now comes the moment where everything turned shocking. On January the 8th, 2020, Harry and Meghan delivered a bombshell that reverberated around the globe. With a single statement on Instagram, they announced their intention to step back as senior members of the royal family. They declared they would pursue financial independence, carve out a new role for themselves, and divide their time between the United Kingdom and North America. They emphasised that they would still support the Queen, but they would do so on their own terms. The world was stunned, the palace was blindsided, and William was reportedly furious. Because here lies the contradiction. To the public, the statement looked carefully, crafted, polite, even respectful. But behind the scenes, its timing and delivery landed like a blow. The Queen had not approved it. Charles had not approved it. William most certainly had not approved it. The Sussexes had acted entirely on their own. And within the monarchy, such independence was not simply bold. It was viewed as outright treason. Think about what this meant. The royal family thrives on absolute control. Every announcement is choreographed. Every photograph is planned. Every speech is reviewed until every word fits perfectly into the institution's narrative. And Harry and Meghan bypassed it all. With a single social media post, they shattered decades of protocol and centuries of unwritten rules. And here is the emotional twist that reframes it entirely. To Harry, this was not rebellion. It was survival. He had watched what the institution had done to his mother. He had seen the way Meghan was collapsing under the same merciless weight. He was determined that history would not repeat itself. To him, walking away was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of protection, the only way he knew to save his wife, his son, and himself. But to William there was no nuance, no justification. It was betrayal, pure and simple. Not only a betrayal of the family, but of the monarchy itself. In his world, the crown always comes first. Duty comes before everything, even before blood. And for the heir, the notion that his own brother could turn his back on that sacred duty was unthinkable, unforgivable. The fallout was immediate. An emergency gathering was convened at Sandringham, quickly dubbed the Sandringham Summit. The Queen, Charles, William and Harry sat together in a tense attempt to hammer out the terms of the split. Imagine that scene for a moment. Centuries of tradition weighed heavily on the shoulders of one family, now in open crisis. Harry pleading desperate for the freedom to live his life on his own terms. William simmering with rage at what he saw as reckless disrespect. The Queen trying as always to steady the crown to hold the institution together, even as it threatened to fracture. Reports would later suggest that William left the meeting angrier than ever, confiding to friends that he felt blindsided by Harry, that trust between them was broken beyond repair, that the bond they had once relied on was finished. And here is the deep irony. Harry believed that stepping back would ease the strain, that it would create space for healing and reconciliation. Instead, it tore the wound open wider. The split was anything but clean. The Sussexes were stripped of their His and Her Royal Highness titles. They lost their public funding. They were even banned from using the word royal in their branding. To Harry, these punishments felt harsh, almost vindictive. To William, they were not punishment at all. They were justice, a necessary consequence for what he saw as a betrayal of crown and country. So let us ask the provocative question that lingers beneath it all. Was this really about Meghan pulling Harry away, as critics so often claimed? Or was this about Harry at last seizing control of his own life after decades of living in the shadow of his brother? Meghan may have been the spark, the catalyst, but the decision was Harry's. He wanted out, and that desire, that refusal to play the part assigned to him, was what truly terrified William. Meanwhile, the press revelled in the chaos. They coined the term Megxit, a cruel play on Brexit, pinning the blame squarely on Meghan as if she alone had orchestrated everything, as if Harry were too weak, too passive, too powerless to make decisions for himself. The narrative reduced him once again to the spare, incapable of leading his own life. But Harry, in his own words, rejected that entirely. He stated plainly, "I did what any husband and father would do. He chose Meghan. He chose Archie. He chose freedom." And here is the kicker. Stepping back was not the end of the drama. It was the accelerant that made everything burn hotter. Because now free of the institution's grip, the Sussexes had the power to speak. They were free to share their story, free to reveal the truth as they saw it, free to open the doors that the monarchy had kept locked for centuries. And William understood the danger of that. He knew the monarchy thrived on secrecy, on silence, on the ironclad code that had preserved it for generations. Never complain, never explain. But Harry, he was preparing to break that code wide open. Yet before the revelations exploded, there was exile. Harry and Meghan left Britain behind not for a brief retreat, but for good. They settled in California, choosing palm trees over palaces, sunshine over shadows. But freedom came with a price. Their financial support was cut off. Their royal security was stripped away. They were left to piece together a new life entirely on their own. From scratch, they had to build something sustainable, something independent. Deals with Netflix, Spotify and publishers soon followed, giving them resources to stand on their own feet. But along with those opportunities came a flood of endless criticism. Every move scrutinised, every decision attacked as if leaving the monarchy meant they had forfeited the right to peace. And through it all, William only grew harder, more unyielding. If Harry held even a faint hope that his brother might soften that time and understanding might bring reconciliation, he was mistaken. To William, Harry's departure was not a private disagreement, but an unforgivable betrayal. It was not only a betrayal of him as a brother, but of the monarchy itself, the institution William was born to defend at all costs. And so the question emerges, which is stronger blood or the crown? For William, the answer was the crown. For Harry, it was family. Two brothers, shaped by the same childhood trauma, reached two starkly different conclusions. And here is the sharpest irony. The very act Harry believed would protect and save his own family became the act that severed his bond with William, perhaps forever. Because stepping back may have marked the beginning of freedom, but it also marked the point of no return. What followed, the interviews, the memoirs, the accusations, would transform what had once been a quiet, private rift into an open war. A war in which both men believed themselves to be right. A war that left the monarchy itself exposed, vulnerable and shaken in ways no one could have imagined. Yet the greatest explosion was still ahead. Leaving the firm was one thing, but Harry was not simply content to walk away. He was preparing to reveal, to show the world what life inside the palace was truly like. And once those secrets were spoken aloud, nothing would ever be the same again. So, what happens when centuries of silence are broken in front of millions? What happens when a prince and his wife sit across from one of the most powerful interviewers in the world and lay bare their truth, unfiltered and raw? That was the in. The moment the world witnessed on March the 7th, 2021, when Harry and Meghan sat down with Oprah Winfrey for a 2-hour television event that shook the monarchy to its very foundations. Here is the hook. The crown had endured wars, abdications and scandals across centuries, but it had never encountered anything quite like this. A global primetime confession broadcast to millions, unfiltered, raw and impossible to ignore. The setting itself was deceptively simple, an outdoor garden, 2 chairs with Oprah seated between them. But while the scene appeared calm and unassuming, the words spoken were nothing short of explosive. Meghan began with measured composure, carefully choosing her tone. Yet as the questions grew sharper and the conversation dug deeper, the polished facade began to crack. What emerged was heartbreaking. She revealed that during her time as a working royal, she had been suicidal, so crushed by loneliness and pressure that she no longer wished to live. She confessed that she had reached out to the institution for help, desperate for support, only to be told no. No, because seeking help would look bad for the monarchy. Think about that for a moment. A duchess pleading for mental health assistance was denied not for lack of resources, but for the sake of optics. And then came the bombshell that stunned the world, the revelation no one could ever forget. Meghan claimed that within the royal household there had been conversations, actual discussions, about how dark her son Archie's skin might be when he was born. Let that sink in. At the very heart of the family, meant to symbolise Britain itself, the institution representing unity and tradition, Meghan alleged that racism had crept into its walls. Oprah's astonished reaction, what echoed across the globe, capturing the collective disbelief of millions who could scarcely believe what they had just heard. And here lies the contradiction that struck at the very heart of the monarchy's identity. For generations, it has portrayed itself as an institution above politics, above prejudice, a unifying symbol for a diverse Commonwealth. Yet, here was Meghan accusing that very family of harbouring racial bias. It was the kind of charge that could not be brushed aside with a polite smile or a carefully scripted statement. It was dynamite, and once spoken, it could not be contained. But Meghan did not stop there. She spoke with painful clarity about the way the palace had failed to defend her against false and damaging press stories, stories that painted her as the villain while shielding and protecting others. She described the experience not as simple neglect, but as something deliberate. She said she felt silenced, controlled, stripped of her voice, and utterly alone. Then Harry entered the conversation, and his words carried the raw weight of betrayal. He confessed that he too felt trapped by the system, caught in a cage he had not chosen. He added that William and Charles were just as trapped, even if they could not or would not admit it to themselves. He revealed that his own father had stopped taking his calls, leaving him feeling financially cut off and abandoned. The spare, once again, was cast adrift, punished for daring to walk away. But the most piercing line of all came when Harry drew a direct comparison between Meghan's suffering and Diana's. He admitted that his deepest fear was history repeating itself, that Meghan would be pursued, hounded, broken down, and possibly destroyed in the same way his mother had been. To Harry, leaving the monarchy was not weakness. It was not betrayal. It was the only way left to save the woman he loved and the family he had chosen to protect. Now, let us confront the difficult question head on. Was this act an expression of bravery, or was it an act of betrayal? Millions of viewers around the world were left shaken, some moved to tears, some outraged, some deeply heartbroken. Others, however, saw the interview as a calculated strike, a deliberate attempt to build sympathy and strengthen the couple's brand in America. Yet, whatever one's perspective, the interview accomplished one undeniable thing. It forced the monarchy, so accustomed to silence, to respond. And how did William react? Reports suggest he was furious. He felt blindsided, humiliated, wounded. For a man who had dedicated his entire life to defending the crown, Harry's words were not just criticism, they were daggers aimed at the very heart of the institution. Only days later, when a reporter shouted a question asking whether the royal family was racist, William broke tradition and snapped back. "We are very much not a racist family." It was a rare unscripted response, one that revealed just how deeply the bombshell allegations had cut. Here lies the bitter irony. The monarchy has long survived by clinging to its golden rule, never complain, never explain. Yet now cornered by the power of Harry and Meghan's revelations, it found itself forced to explain. The Queen issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that recollections may vary, but insisting that the concerns raised would be taken very seriously. It was diplomatic, certainly, but it was also cold, distant, and to many deeply inadequate. So let us dig deeper. Why was this interview so profoundly dangerous to William? Because it was not simply about Harry leaving the family, it was about Harry exposing it. The monarchy has always depended on mystique, on secrecy, on the carefully crafted illusion of unity and strength. Harry ripped that curtain wide open. He forced the world to see dysfunction, cruelty and hypocrisy at the very heart of the crown. And to William, that act was not just reckless, it was unforgivable. Here is a surprising twist. While the Oprah interview left the palace enraged, it had the opposite effect on many outside those walls. It galvanised Harry and Meghan's supporters. In America, they became symbols of resistance figures who stood against outdated institutions and the suffocating weight of tradition. They were celebrated as voices of modernity, independence, and courage. In Britain, however, the reaction was far more divided. Some admired their bravery, applauding their decision to speak their truth. Others branded them as selfish, even traitors, accusing them of tearing down the monarchy for personal gain. The divide widened, stretching across continents, splitting public opinion in two. But amid all the noise, one truth rose above everything else. The bond between William and Harry was gone. Whatever scraps of brotherhood had survived the rupture of Megxit were reduced to ashes by the firestorm of the Oprah interview. Consider the situation from William's perspective. He had been raised from birth to protect the monarchy at all costs, and now his own brother had not only abandoned the institution, but had publicly tarnished it before the entire world. How could he forgive that? How could he ever again place his trust in Harry? And what of Harry? He believed he had been left with no other choice. Remaining silent, he thought, would have destroyed Meghan. Speaking out, however risky, was the only path left to save her and to save their family. Ask yourself this: could he have done anything else? And what happened when Meghan entered their world? That is where the story takes its dramatic turn, a turn no one inside the monarchy had anticipated. Because Meghan Markle was never simply a wife stepping into royal life. She was a revolution, and that revolution would divide the brothers forever. Now consider the deeper truth. What if your destiny had been decided before you had even spoken your very first word? What if your entire identity, your worth, your purpose had been written the instant you drew your first breath? That is the brutal reality of monarchy. One child is the heir, the other is the spare. And within the House of Windsor, those roles were never just ceremonial titles. They were cages, golden, glittering, but cages nonetheless. Let us speak plainly. The monarchy does not merely tolerate hierarchy, it depends on it. It thrives because of it. Its very survival demands that one figure be elevated above all others, that there be one clear, unquestionable line of succession. William embodied that line. From the instant he entered the world, he was treated as if he were the most precious cargo in the kingdom. Every step was rehearsed, every lesson carefully engineered, every possible misstep guarded against with ruthless precision. Harry, on the other hand, was essential only so long as William's future remained uncertain. His role was never central. He was the backup, the contingency plan, the living safety net in case fate intervened. And as soon as William became a father, with every new royal birth, Harry slipped further down the ladder, his sense of purpose shrinking until it seemed to vanish altogether. Now imagine what that must feel like, to be needed and yet expendable, to be loved and yet constantly pushed to the margins, to be visible in the world's gaze and yet invisible within your own family's hierarchy. That paradox was not just a chapter in Harry's story, it became the very essence of his life. And the palace did nothing to disguise these dynamics, quite the opposite. It leaned into them. William was always the serious student trained and groomed for the crown. He was photographed, diligently studying, practicing diplomacy, and shaking hands with statesmen and dignitaries even as a teenager. He was the future, and the world was reminded of it at every turn. Harry, meanwhile, was cast in a different light. He was permitted to be cheeky the naughty one to the Joker. The press devoured it, splashing his antics across headlines, and the palace allowed it to continue. Why? Because it reinforced the narrative they wanted the world to see. William was king material. Harry was the colourful background, the comic relief in the royal story. But pause here and consider. What happens to a child who grows up hearing again and again that he is the spare? Does he embrace the so-called freedom of lowered expectations? Or does he quietly ache for validation he may never be given?